is up, you guys? Welcome back to my channel. My name is Danielle Hallen and I am back with another true crime video, and we are going into October. I used to do a lot of Halloween themed videos, but it ended up just sometimes feeling kind of yucky. I did Halloween about 4 or 5 years ago when I first started my channel, but I no longer do that. However, I also co-host a podcast called Crime After Crime with John Lorden, another true crime YouTuber. I know this sounds completely unrelated, but just hang in there with me. And we recently did a Halloween episode, and I stumbled across so many cases while researching for that I had absolutely no idea existed. Like things that I'd never heard of before, but they should be very well known because they were massive cases, all kind of revolving around Halloween, or one of the crimes was committed on Halloween. So I will be covering a handful of those throughout the month of October. Side note, definitely go and check out the podcast episode. I spoke about a series of letters that were anonymously sent out the night of Halloween to Lancaster, California, and it was like 260 some letters, all with like personal information of the recipients, and it was like blackmailing, crazy madness. So definitely go and check out that episode. But today we are going to be speaking about a serial killer that I was completely unaware of. And this serial killer is known as the Thrill Killer, or the New Jersey Thrill Killer. This man absolutely terrorized New Jersey in the early 80s, but if I'm being quite frank, he had pretty much terrorized anyone that was in his path from the age of 5 years old, which I know sounds absolutely unbelievable, but just trust me, I will get into it. Now, the attorney that was working on his case has theorized that he had well over 100 victims. Pretty much the number is up in the air, but he was only ever convicted of 6 murders. And I think there were a few more on top of that. I think only 3 that he was suspected of. There definitely could be many more victims out there that we are just completely unaware of. And I know a lot of you guys spend a lot of time on NamUs. And so this is definitely one to kind of investigate on your own time. Now, before I get into the case, I do want to first thank Audible for partnering with me on today's video. Audible is the leading provider for spoken word entertainment, and you guys know is hands down probably my favorite way to consume content. Audible has so much to offer you guys, from audiobooks to Audible originals, sleep tracks, guided meditation, and there are so many different genres to choose from. I'm sure you can guess that my favorite that I gravitate towards is true crime, but there's also history, science, romance, there's children's audiobooks that I use a lot for my homeschooling, so there is pretty much something for everyone. It's also incredibly convenient to use, which I'm a huge fan of. You can listen anytime, anywhere, from any device. I listen to Audible a lot to pass the time while I'm doing chores or working out. And as a member, you get a ton of great perks, which I am always down for. Audible members get to choose one title a month from the entire catalog. So that can be new releases, bestsellers, and you get to keep that forever. And you also get access to a growing selection of titles through their Plus catalog, which has probably been my favorite aspect. There are so many audiobooks and things to choose from that are just included in your membership. And I'm personally so excited because I have finally gotten around to circling back to one of my favorite new up-and-coming authors, Ali Reynolds. I have recommended one of her audiobooks before, Shiver. A lot of you guys will probably remember because so many of you went to listen to this audiobook after I recommended it. It is my all-time favorite. I love a good mystery that's actually a mystery, and most of the time I can guess exactly what's going to happen right away, and that alone just had me absolutely hooked to Ali Reynolds and that audiobook. And so she actually just released a new audiobook called The Swell. It was released in July, and I finally have time to listen to it, and so far, absolute perfection. So if you want to check out Audible and all that they have to offer, their new members get to try out Audible for free for 30 days, which is a heck of a deal. All you have to do is go to audible.com/Danielle or text Danielle to 500-500. Thank you again to Audible for partnering with me on today's video. They allow me to do what I do and give back to these families the most that I possibly can. So now on to the details of this case. Now, while this all really started with the birth of an absolute monster of a human being back in 1940, We first need to start with the case that brought what was happening across New York and New Jersey to the attention of police in the first place. And this jumps us forward in time to January 14th, 1983. So that afternoon in Ocean Township, New Jersey, right off of the Jersey Shore area, a group of young boys were playing behind a Burger King off of Route 35. There was this Burger King that was there was an empty lot that was behind it that used to be a motel, and then just behind that was this lot that was a wooded area. The boys were in this wooded area, they were playing, they were trying to build a fort, and they ended up stumbling across something absolutely terrifying that they weren't at all expecting. Remains. When police arrived, the first thing that they noticed was that this young woman was, first of all, already very badly decomposed, so there really wasn't a lot of information they could take probably from the remains themselves. She also was completely dressed still. There was absolutely no sign that a sexual assault had occurred, which with that type of situation was likely something they were expecting. One thing that they did notice that was strange was that despite being fully clothed, this young woman again had absolutely no shoes on her feet. They were nowhere surrounding her. So while there were so many questions up in the air about what exactly had happened to this young woman, there was one thing just very clear from the get-go. This young woman had been brutally murdered. She had been shot 4 times in the head. Right away, her remains were sent to a medical examiner to try to determine what on earth had happened. And unfortunately, they weren't really able to get a lot of answers. Keep in mind, we are talking about 1983. I believe it was 1984 when DNA testing became even a thing. And even then, it was not used very often because it was incredibly expensive. So the only thing they were really able to determine was, in fact, a girl in her late teens. And she had likely been murdered about 6 months prior. And with all of this information combined, police believed that they knew exactly who this was. Another investigator had been working very diligently on a case from 6 months prior, and that was the disappearance of 18-year-old Anna Olesiewicz. Anna was from Camden, New Jersey. She was the youngest of 5 kids, and she was incredibly close to her family because they had gone through a lot together. They had lost their mother when Anna was only 10 years old, so they definitely were a tight-knit group, and they relied heavily on each other. They had been through a lot, but Anna was pushing through life, and she was excited to make a life of her own. She just graduated from high school and she enrolled into Camden Community College, and she was supposed to start fall semester in 1982. But before she began that new life journey, she wanted to have one last hurrah, like one last final weekend. So on the weekend of August 27th, 1982, Anna met with a good friend and they planned to head to Asbury Park, New Jersey, which is a well-known area along the Jersey Shore. It's where the boardwalk is. There's a lot of really fun things to do. It was like the place to be during summertime. So that afternoon, August 27th, 1982, the girls were hanging out on the boardwalk. They were sitting on a bench just outside of a club to listen to the great music that was coming out of it when Anna's friend realized she had to use the restroom and wanted to go down the road back to the house they were staying at to do so. And so Anna decided that she wanted to stay on the bench at this boardwalk. It should only take her friend a few minutes. So she was going to hang out there and wait for her. Anna even left her shoes in the car. She left her purse in the car that her friend took. And she was just there on the boardwalk by herself. When her friend came back to join her again, Anna was nowhere to be found. As the day went on and the weekend came to a close, Anna was still nowhere to be found. According to her brother that she was incredibly close to, Anna was not the kind of person to just kind of up and vanish. She wasn't someone that would run away. She had absolutely no reason to. She was so excited to be starting community college. She had so much life and family to live for. So right away, he kind of knew that something likely wasn't right. And when she never returned home that Sunday and no one could reach her still, she was reported as missing. Right away, there were massive searches for Anna. Her brother endlessly searched up and down that boardwalk for the upcoming months. Brought flyers. He would show people her picture. He was asking anyone and everyone if they had seen her. But for months, there was absolutely nothing. Despite all of their efforts, despite all of their searching, nobody knew where Anna could have possibly gone until these these remains were found. The investigator heard of the discovery of these remains, and the first thing that stuck out was that this teenage girl that was found didn't have any shoes on, because that was one of the big things in her case that was baffling everyone and pointing towards the fact that she didn't just decide to run away, because she took absolutely nothing with her, not even a pair of shoes. So immediately got in contact with the medical examiner, and they were able to use dental records and got a positive identity. The remains that had just been tossed behind a Burger King into the woods were in fact those of Anna Alesiewicz. This was a devastating shock to the community and Anna's family, not the outcome that anyone would hope to happen. This 18-year-old girl was innocently at the beach trying to enjoy the end of summer. How on earth did she end up dead in just a matter of minutes of being left alone? How does something like that happen? And within a week, police ended up getting their answer, and they likely weren't at all prepared for what the investigation was about to turn into. Anna was far from the only victim. As police are trying to wrap their head around what happened, trying to figure out how they're going to solve this murder of this young woman that had been so brutally stripped away from her family and a long life that she was looking forward to living, a 22-year-old woman named Teresa Smith just walks into the police station. And she said that she had information that she thought was going to be helpful. She had seen the body of Anna after Anna had been murdered, and she knew exactly who had killed her. And this wasn't a random murder. The man behind it was an absolute monster. Teresa Smith gave police the name of Richard Biegenwald, and when police looked him up, they knew exactly the kind of harm that he was capable of. So before I get into what Teresa had to say, the information that she had on Anna's murder, this Richard Biegenwald character, we need to travel back in time again to 1942 when Richard was born to understand the kind of person that they were dealing with at the time. So Richard Biegenwald was born to Sally and Alfred Biegenwald in 1940, and his entire childhood was nothing short of an utter disaster. So his father was a very severe alcoholic, likely due to trauma from his own in his childhood. He lost his leg in some freak train accident when he was like 11 years old, and he was not at all much of a father from the way he's been described. Pretty much his only communication with his son Richard was through abusing him. And according to most, he had essentially no interest whatsoever in his family. And in stark contrast, his mother Sally was constantly involved in Richard's life. She was trying to guide him back to the light, which you'll see why in a little bit, in order to save him, pretty much. She was very strict. She was described as a disciplinarian. She was well put together. She was a hard worker. She cared deeply for Richard. But unfortunately, there was just something going on with Richard. And I am not going to pretend that I know what it was, because it has baffled even psychiatrists, psychologists, pretty much for an eternity. So Richard was far from an easy kid. He was very badly behaved even as a toddler, which as a mother, I feel like toddlers, yes, they can be challenging, but he was on an entirely different level. And Sally was constantly trying to redirect him while his father was just physically harming him to try to get the point across, and nothing seemed to work. Even at the age of 5, Richard was doing absolutely unbelievable, horrid things. At the age of 5, he set fire to his home and was displaying obvious struggles with mental health. Like, there was just something that was off. So right away, upon setting fire to his home, he was sent to Rockland County Psychiatric Center for observation, because they needed to figure out what was going on and why a child this age was already doing so many dark things. Now, I do know he was eventually diagnosed with a handful of different conditions. I have not been able to figure out which ones, but despite sending him for help and trying to understand where his mind was at, he seemed to just get more dangerous and aggressive with each passing year. By the age of 8 years old, Richard was so wildly out of control that he was sent to a place called the Children's Village, which is a private school for disturbed children in New York, and there he He just completely baffled the psychiatrists. According to their notes, at the ripe young age of 8 years old, Richard was already heavily drinking. He was involved in gambling. Like, my brain, I have an 8-year-old, like how did his mind even comprehend what he was doing? And it didn't seem like he was worried about it or that he cared in the slightest. When the school realized how deeply disturbed he seemed to be at the age of 9, they sent him to Bellevue Hospital for electroshock therapy treatments. So that kind of goes to show you the extremes here of his behavior. Granted, back in 1940 to 1950, that whole time, I feel like mental health was severely misunderstood. So kind of take a lot of what I'm saying with that in mind, because things were handled very differently back then. After the treatments were done, there was no change. They placed him into a state training school for boys in Warwick, New York, essentially because no one could handle him. But there, imagine this, was absolutely no progress. During his stay at school, he was repeatedly involved in illegal activity. He was accused of theft numerous times. He also was constantly trying to convince others in there with him to escape. And the times where he was allowed to go home to visit his mother, those visits went equally as terrible. So at this point, Sally had divorced Alfred, thankfully. He did not seem like a great person, and she had moved to Staten Island, and she was living in a little house there. And she welcomed her son with open arms every time he came home, not knowing that he was showing up with like open hands, ready to steal from her. He would come home and steal money from her. He would then leave the house in the darkness of the night, break into his neighbors' homes and steal from them. And then during one of these instances where he was sent home at the age of 11, he had yet another incident with fire, but this time he set himself on fire in his mother's home. Now, because of this, obviously, there was another psychiatric evaluation that had to be done, and they found that Richard had a, quote, extreme fantasy of death. Now, because of that, it doesn't sound like he set himself on fire out of like anything like depression or, you know, things along those lines. It just sounded like he was so fascinated with death that he genuinely wanted to possibly experience it himself. Richard remained in the state school up until he was 16 years old. Obviously, still no progress. And by that time, he had finally graduated from the 8th grade and he was released back into his mother's care. Right away, he was enrolled into McKee Technical High School, which was a decision that I do not think he made himself. I don't know if it was a requirement leaving the state school that he had to enroll in high school, or maybe that's just what he thought he should do afterwards, or his mom thought he should do afterwards. But regardless, it didn't last long. He ended up dropping out, I believe, within a few weeks. And from there, he booked it out of Staten Island all the way to Nashville, Tennessee. And this is where his more legitimate crime life began. Richard spent, I want to say, about 2 years in Nashville. And while there, he faced his very first federal charges. For some reason, in 1958, at the age of 18 years old, he was like, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to steal a car and I'm going to drive it across state lines. Obviously, a felony. So he was apprehended by federal agents and ended up spending a year in a federal reformatory. Once he was released towards the very end of 1958, he decided to return back to Staten Island. And he had even more intentions of committing crimes, but this time he was going to escalate it very quickly. He wanted to murder someone. So that's exactly what he did on December 18th, 1958. Richard and a male accomplice. I'm only not naming the male accomplice because I have seen so far 3 different names that he's gone under, and I can't confirm which is which, so I'm not trying to name drop someone involved in this, not knowing. Richard and this male accomplice decided to rob a nearby grocery store in Bayonne, New Jersey. Now, the plan was for this accomplice to wait outside in the car, and Richard was going to go into this grocery store with a sawed-off shotgun, hold up the store, and simply take money. But within moments of entering the store, shots rang out, and Richard came flying out of the store into the car. I don't even know if he ended up stealing anything. When police arrived, they found 47-year-old Steven Sladowski shot multiple times, a completely senseless killing. Steven was an assistant municipal attorney, and he was that by day, and at night he was a supporter of his wife. He and his wife Estelle had just purchased this grocery store. It seemed that it was her dream that she wanted to accomplish, so in order to help her out, he decided he would take the night shifts working behind the deli. And unfortunately, that night he was working, and Richard had taken him from everyone that he loved. So while the entire town was trying to come to grips with this absolutely senseless murder of this well-known, well-loved man, the duo responsible were nowhere to be found. They had completely fled the area. And the way that they were caught honestly shows me how little Richard cared about anyone or anything that he did. I feel like he was the kind of person that craved trouble. He craved trouble. He wanted to harm people. He enjoyed harming people. And he was okay in doing so even when he was running from killing someone. So 2 days after their escape, they were located in Maryland. So an officer ended up approaching the duo in their car. I can't say for sure what this officer was approaching them for. At the time, this officer was not aware of who they were and what they had been doing. And I feel like in most situations where there is a criminal running from the police, they had fled a scene of where they had murdered someone. In their mind, it would be logical to either like stay cool, like try to get through this without anyone questioning anything, potentially like drive off. Instead, Richard decided to pull up his sawed-off shotgun and shoot the police officer. Again, the duo fled. Shortly after this, they were waved down by a second police officer. I am not sure if this police officer was aware of what had happened to the first. I think this officer was just waving them down for speeding. And again, Richard pulled out the gun and shot at the officer. But this time, thankfully, he missed, and the officer was able to stop both men, wrestle the gun away from Richard, and both of them were apprehended. Now, while Richard was seemingly incredibly pleased with himself and everything that he had done, his accomplice handed over all information possible, like word vomit, to the police. He told them that they had been running after Richard had murdered a man in Bayonne, New Jersey, and so right away they were able to connect the two situations and extradite both of them back to New Jersey, where Richard was charged with first-degree murder. Now, this trial was an incredibly tough one because Richard was only 18 or 19 years old at the time, and his attorney, Albert Kraut, tried to claim, quote, "This unfortunate situation would not have happened if he had received help in the institutions where he was a mental patient as a youngster." But most people didn't at all agree with what Albert Kraut was trying to say. Richard seemed to be a cold-blooded killer. Every single bit of his past seemed to be just riddled with him loving the crimes that he was committing and harming himself and others. He spent his whole life obsessing over murder and death, and during all of this time, more so than most individuals, he was in fact seeking medical assistance for his mental health, and nothing seemed to be making a difference. So this kind of accusation that was being thrown out there that he just never got the help he received, it just wasn't ringing true for a lot of people. And when they asked Richard why on earth he killed Steven, why he did what he did, he said he felt, quote, "outlawed by the people in my community," end quote, and that he only tried to rob the store to, quote, "prove my standing, I didn't need money," end quote. So you can see that even his answer to that didn't at all answer the question, and no one quite understood by what he meant that he felt outlawed by the people in his community. It seemed like he was just upset that people would not accept him for what he wanted to be able to do to people and the life he wanted to lead, which was a criminal one. And so it seems in his mind, he should be accepted for who he is, the dangers that come along with that. Ultimately, he was facing the electric chair. That was what they were going for because of, again, the senseless nature of this murder, his history. But Steven's wife ended up speaking up, and she said that enough blood had been shed. She had absolutely no interest in adding to that, so she didn't want Richard to have the death penalty. So instead, he was sentenced to life in prison at such a young age. So I'm sure you're thinking, okay, life in prison. This guy that nobody has been able to control or manage or figure out will now be unable to harm himself or anyone else. But unfortunately, you are going to be sorely disappointed. Richard first served at Trenton State Prison from 59 to 67. After this, he was sent to Rahway State Prison. And during this whole prison stay, he had the very typical ups and downs that most people do. He had been in trouble for fights quite a few handful of times. One of those times, it was bad enough to put him in segregation for almost a year, so I can only imagine. He also was somehow found to be in possession of gun parts and ammunition while in prison. So you can see that he was not deterred at all by being locked away forever. And he seemed pretty adamant about getting out. So he did try for parole 3 separate times between 72 and 74. And when you try for parole, you have to have an updated psych evaluation. All of these things have to be done. And each time his psych eval was, quote, so-so. I have absolutely no idea what they meant by that. And then obviously his behavior was in question. He had freaking weapons while in prison. But somehow, some way, in 75, that all changed. Richard applied for parole yet again, and he was released after serving only 17 years out of his life sentence. And get this, he was released on good behavior. Now, the good behavior they're speaking about was he had apparently helped a sick officer or gone to a sick officer's aid at one point, and then he also helped get out the smoke from a fire. And again, not quite sure what that means. But I guess those were the things amidst all of the absolutely negative, awful things that he had done, including murder someone for no reason, that they're like, oh, good behavior, let's let this guy out. So this man was let loose back in society. And I will say, at first, at least from what we know, which I don't think we know anything at this time, during this time period, he was attempting to live a non-criminal life. Again, I say that so loosely because I don't believe it for even a second. I think that's what it looked like from the outside. He got a handful of jobs. He worked at a few automobile shops. He painted houses for a little while. He didn't miss any appointments with his parole officer, like on time for everything. He even started dating someone. Granted, it was a little bit questionable. He apparently fell absolutely head over heels for his mom's neighbor, Diane, who was 16 years old. So obviously, this didn't really go over very well for pretty much anyone. First of all, Richard was twice Diane's age. And also they were polar opposites, which I personally find very fascinating just from a psychological point of view, because I feel like that may have reminded him of his parents' relationship, because his mom and dad seemed to be complete polar opposites as well. But Diane, at the time that they met and started dating, was still in high school. She was incredibly intelligent. She was described as just being absolutely stunning. She grew up in a very strict family. And so her father essentially lost his ever-loving mind when she started to date Richard, who was a known convicted murderer. And everyone in the neighborhoods that he ever lived in said that, like, you could tell something was off because he did nothing but lurk. Like, I don't know any other way to describe it other than he just lurked around the neighborhoods. And then when Diane ended up graduating from high school, her father just fully went off the deep end when she said that she had full intentions of marrying Richard. But despite the protests of pretty much everyone that knew about the situation, this couple continued on. And keep in mind, during this time, all appearances, Richard was changing his ways. He was trying to move forward with his life. He was trying to do better. But as I said, that couldn't be further from the truth. So by 1977, a lot of people weren't aware, but Richard had completely ghosted his parole officer. And probably the most interesting thing about that is that when he completely ghosted his parole officer, it doesn't seem that anybody tried to find him and charge him for that. That is something that usually immediately gets you thrown back in prison for a while. And also during this time, on top of completely ghosting his parole officer, he was a suspect in a sexual assault case in New York. This man should have been snatched up off the streets in a heartbeat, but he was never brought in or arrested until years later in 1980. That's how long it took. So police in New York that were investigating this sexual assault got wind that Richard was at a party in Brooklyn. So I guess they saw this as their time to shine. So they went in and they arrested him. And while Richard is sitting in this detention center for these months, with these accusations against him, I guess Diane said, you know what, there's no better time than now, let's get married. So on September 2nd, Diane came to visit him and they tied the knot. Ultimately, he never ended up being charged in the sexual assault. While police felt they had the right guy, they had to prove this. They put him in a lineup. The victim came in and unfortunately was not able to pick him out. So they had no choice but to release him in regards to that. But they did finally decide to send him to Rahway again. They sent him back there, the place he had just been released from years prior, to serve 6 months in prison for his parole violations. So he at least was finally picked up on that. Once he was released back in February of 1980, he decided he was going to book it out of New York. Now, the original plan that he had with Diane was to move to Staten Island, where his mother lived. He wanted to be close to her. That's where he wanted to start his life. But he ended up finding out, now that he was back on parole and basically forced to do it, or he was going to go back to prison, that parole officers in New York were doing very routine, unannounced home searches and visits, and he wanted nothing to do with that. So he decided to leave New York altogether and move to New Jersey. And after moving to New Jersey, he hooked back up with a good friend of his that he had met in prison, a man named Darren Fitzgerald. Darren had been incarcerated, I think, when they met for armed robbery, felony armed robbery. He, I think, also had a very long criminal history of forging checks and all these other random things. And in 1982, after reuniting with his friend, Diane and Richard decided to move specifically to Asbury Park. And they lived in an apartment on 507 6th Avenue. And I believe Darren himself managed the apartment and also lived there. So now they're living in this apartment, which I believe was like a converted Victorian house type of thing. And they lived across the hall from each other. But again, from the outside, they appeared to be average citizens dabbling in a few potentially questionable activities. And from everything I have seen, Asbury Park, and this section in particular, was not a great place at this time. But the reality was so much worse. Chaos ensued at this point, from this point on, and likely prior to this that we don't know of. And this brings us back forward in time to Teresa Smith and what she told police that night when she walked into the police station and why this scared them so badly. Teresa's sitting there with these police officers, and what she says, in my opinion, is absolutely just mind-boggling. I honestly am a little shocked because a lot of it did not make her look good at all. So I can only imagine this was a very difficult conversation to have, and it absolutely blew police away. So Teresa said that she knew Richard through his wife, Diane. I guess Diane and Teresa Smith had worked together at a local diner in Asbury Park, and after meeting Diane, somehow Teresa ended up moving in with the couple. I believe they were on the bottom floor of the apartment, and below that was the cellar, and I guess that was a part of Richard and Diane's apartment, and so they set this area up as, I guess, a room for Teresa. So she lived in their apartment with them from June of 1982 to December of 1982, about a 6-month period, and she said that during this time, she was made very aware that Richard was a murderer. Now, I have absolutely no idea how that casual conversation came up. I don't know if she's ever explained it. The way she describes it is just so casual, which is very unnerving. But Teresa basically said that she became very close to Richard while living there, and he often spoke to her about his desires to kill people. And there are even a lot of different bits of speculation out there. They say that she was his protege, that they had like a romantic relationship. I can't confirm that. But he did seem to actually take her under his wing as his protege. Now, together, Teresa and Richard would go to the boardwalk of Asbury Park, which is where Anna had vanished. And according to Teresa, they went there and spent a lot of time specifically to prey on teenage girls because Richard was essentially teaching her how to pick out a victim. Teresa claimed that over the first few months of living there, on top of going victim hunting with Richard, he would also encourage her to kill someone herself because he basically wanted her to prove that she was capable of doing it. So Teresa did admit to police that she actually lured in a girl that she worked with, a coworker, and drove around with her for like an extended period of time one night, the whole time in the car contemplating if she was going to actually murder this woman or not. And ultimately, she realized that she couldn't do it, so she dropped the woman off and headed back home. She backed out. And interestingly, it was the exact same night that Anna Olesiewicz went missing. Teresa said that after she took this coworker home, she returned to her basement room in Richard and Diane's apartment, and she went to sleep for the night. But she remembered being abruptly woken up by Richard in like early morning hours, and she said she didn't get up or really respond to him or know what she didn't know what he wanted. So ultimately, she just kind of ignored him and he left. But after a few minutes, she couldn't get back to sleep, so she decided to get up, go into the main level of the apartment, and was looking out of the window that faced towards the driveway and the garage that was behind this apartment complex. And she saw Richard's car sitting there, and she could very clearly see like the outline or the shadow of someone in the passenger seat. Now, she didn't think much of it until the next morning. The next morning, she ended up speaking to Richard and saying, I saw someone in your car last night. Did you go out and get a victim? And his response was that he was, quote, due for a victim. So essentially, yes. He claimed that he had actually originally gone out and picked someone up for Teresa to go on and murder. He realized that she had chickened out the first time with her coworker, so he went to pick her up someone himself to try to be there to ensure that she accomplished what he was hoping she would. He claimed that when he woke her up that night, that he was trying to get her outside to show her this victim that he chose for her, which was Anna, and she wouldn't get up, so he ultimately just left and essentially took matters into his own hands. He then told Teresa that he had something to show her in the garage. Teresa was able to describe to the police the outfit that Anna was wearing at the time. She gave a description, of what she saw in the garage. I don't think she actually knew who this individual was until it started being reported that her remains were found and her picture was put out in the newspaper and all of these different things. And that's when she was like, oh crap, this is the girl that I saw in the garage that night. And she also explained that Richard, about a month later, ended up giving her a ring saying that this ring had belonged to the girl that he had killed, and he wanted to give it to her. And this was, in fact, a ring that her family should have been on her at the time, but was missing when she was found. And the description seemed to match. But at this point, Teresa said that she was freaked out, that she felt like she was in something she was never going to get out of. And so she ended up giving the ring to Diane, who Richard had basically told Teresa to not say a single word to. It doesn't appear that Diane really knew what exactly was going on. Teresa said that in the end, Darren Fitzgerald, the neighbor, helped Richard dispose of Anne's body. Now, she went on to tell police a little bit of the dynamics of the apartment and the relationship with Darren. She went on to describe that Darren and Richard had like this secret room that they had built within the apartments. It was like a 3x8 room, that there were tons of weapons and scary things in there, that they had all sorts of drugs in there. And she even said that they were so secretive and like sketchy that they had created this like weird pathway through the cellar to be able to go like back and forth from each other's apartments without actually having to use the hallway because they didn't want to be seen. Police are just sitting there jaw to the floor, dumbfounded at what they're hearing. This girl admitting that she had gone out numerous times to scope out victims with Richard Biegenwald, that she had seen the body of this young girl that this man had killed and she didn't report it. So they're asking her all these questions like, what on earth? Why didn't you come forward sooner? Why did you participate in all of these things? And according to Teresa, she said that from the moment Richard began to speak about his violence, she realized what he was capable of and that he was very serious, and she did pretty much everything out of fear. She was scared if she didn't listen to him, do what he said, that he was going to kill her. And the moment she was able to move away, which again was in December, a few months after the murder happened, she ran as far as she possibly could. Now, once she saw the news hit that Anna's remains had been found and she recognized the girl as being the girl from the apartment, she was scared that Richard was going to end up coming after her to keep her quiet because she was the only person that possibly knew that he was responsible, and she had now become a risk. So in her mind, the best thing that she could do was to beat him to it, go to police, hope that they believed her so that he would be arrested and she would be safe. Either way, police had to figure out if they could corroborate any of this information, but not just that, they needed to figure out a way to get to Richard without, one, endangering Teresa, two, before he decided to flee upon seeing the news that Anna's remains had been found, and three, in a way that wouldn't potentially end up in yet another police shootout, since that was something that was in his history. Now, first and foremost, they went to corroborate this information. To confirm what Teresa had told them, they decided to try to locate Richard's car because he did not have this car anymore. So it'd be much easier to try to do a forensic examination on it at this point. So they went to the dealer that had originally bought the car from him, and then the dealer led them to who had bought the car from them, and they eventually were led to this sweet older woman who had taken the car. And she thankfully was very okay with the police immediately searching the vehicle. In the headliner of the car were multiple bullet holes around the passenger side, which is exactly where Teresa had seen the outline of someone that night, the night that Anna went missing. Also, when they took a closer look at the car seat itself, it appeared that nothing had really been detailed or cleaned or anything, because there was blood all going down the side of the seat, down to underneath of the seat on the floor. And again, while they didn't have DNA testing at the time, this was enough for them to be like, you know what, we're going to buy this car from you. Take a check so you can go buy a new car, and we are taking this because we need to figure out if this man's responsible to stop him from ever harming anyone else. So the car was sent off for forensic testing, and now it was time to bring in Richard. Now, police actually came up with a pretty brilliant plan on how they were going to be able to arrest him. Again, there were a lot of different worries surrounding his arrest, if he would go willingly, what may come out of it. And so they decided to lure him out of his home on February 22nd, 1983, by having a few guys show up in civilian clothes and pretend to break into Richard's car because they knew he would hear this or see this and immediately come out of the house, and they would have officers hiding in the darkness to pounce. And that is exactly what happened. The plan could not have worked out any better. The moment Richard came out of his house, the police were able to tackle him, apprehend him, and he was thrown in the back of a police car. Meanwhile, police went to find Darren because he had been accused of potentially helping Richard hide the body of Anna. Luckily, thanks to everything that Teresa had told them, they had a lot of information about the home, and when a very quick sweep of both apartments did not turn up Darren, they knew to locate this 3x8 secret room. And sure enough, he had barricaded himself inside. He refused to come out for a short period of time, but once police started throwing threats at him, saying like, we will shoot through this wall, we will get you out one way or another, Darren was like, you know what, I'm gonna go ahead and surrender. So he ended up arrested as well. Now, Diane was also in the home at the time, and again, to this day, it doesn't seem anyone is sure if she had any knowledge of what was going on or not. It doesn't seem like she did, but she was very aware of the things they ended up finding in her home, and so she was arrested on weapons and drug charges. So this brings us to the absolutely terrifying list of things found in these apartments. What they found, honestly, don't even have words. So strewn about the house in a bunch of random places were all sorts of guns. There were handguns, laying about, ammunition of all sorts laying about, casual machine guns. Also ended up finding pipe bombs throughout the home. There was rohypnol, chloral hydrate. There was also something called DMSO, which is dimethyl sulfoxide. And according to what police said, this immediately scared the absolute piss out of them because dimethyl sulfoxide, anything that you mix with it, becomes absorbable by the skin. So when you're talking about a potential serial killer, that's scary. There was also a kit that would apparently turn cocaine into inhalable gas. There was a drill press and a grinder and other things that were there that made it clear that these men were making their own weapons, probably so that hopefully they would not be caught. There was nothing to trace any of these things back to. They had a full-on shoulder rocket launcher that they built that shot out like massive metal balls like it was a damn cannon. They had created like a prototype of a cigarette lighter that they had converted to a single shot weapon. They also had Teflon coated bullets. And police theorized that they had decided to create these in hopes of them breaking through like bulletproof vests, also possibly to penetrate cars. And so you can see why that was so scary, because these aren't just everyday weapons that are already kind of bad enough. These are like things that they are creating to create like deadly cocktails of weapons and chemicals and things to hopefully harm mass amounts of people. And that leads me to the freaking puff adder snake. Yes, you heard me right. So when police were about to go into the home, one of the men, I guess, warned them that down in that like basement area secret room, there was a very venomous snake. And police were like, okay. But when they went down there it is, a puff adder snake. And along with it was a venom extraction apparatus. Now, that had police questioning a lot, but when they found a notebook in the home that highlighted some of their plans that the men had made for these things, it just became that much more terrifying. So I guess the cigarette lighter was something, again, they had created. They were planning on selling it in mass amounts on the black market. They also had been renting it out to people for like $100 per use. And the notebook also highlighted what exactly they were planning to do with the puff adder snake and the venom extractor and the dimethyl sulfoxide. So they apparently were going to mix the snake venom with the dimethyl sulfoxide to create a solution that would be absorbed into the skin. So instead of having to get bit by the snake or anything like that to suffer from its poison, you just had to touch something that had it on it. So they apparently were going to take this solution and put it on payphones in the area. From what I have read, that's not necessarily how it works with puff adder venom. I guess it does only take about 100 milligrams of the venom to kill an adult, and one strike is about 150 to 350 milligrams. And then when you have people that are able to control the amounts, it can get very scary. So I don't know if there is a certain point in which it would immediately kill someone, but basically any sort of absorption would cause some sort of immediate effects, severe pain. There's a whole entire list of them online, and usually within 24 hours, if you do not get proper treatment, you will die. So they were going to do this, to sit back and watch people slowly suffer to death. I can't even begin to think about what these men may have continued on to do, and possibly what they had already done had they not been caught when they were. Now, the search of the home also did help them bring forward the gun that had been used in Anna's murder. That particular gun needed a specific type of ammunition, and out of all the ammunition in the house, there was only one small amount of the specific ammunition, and that ammo was found right near Richard's bed. So that kind of connected the dots there. And meanwhile, while police are just uncovering all these different things, I think it took them 13 plus hours to search this home thoroughly and get everything out of it. Both men are starting to be questioned. Now, I will say, I've got absolutely no clue what Richard said to police. That does not seem to really be documented anywhere, but it does seem he denied everything. He did state he was going to plead not guilty to any charges that were coming against him. But Darren cracked, just like that first accomplice, and he handed over everything to police for a plea deal. So both Darren and Richard were facing murder charges. Obviously, Richard's were first-degree murder. Darren was just an accomplice to murder. So as part of a plea deal, he was going to tell police everything that he knew about Richard's crimes, because while they knew Anna was definitely someone that he had murdered, given everything else, they believed there were more victims. So according to Darren, in early April of 1982, Richard told him he had to show him something in the garage, which is an awfully familiar phrase used by Richard. And when Darren went in, he was showed the body of a murdered young woman underneath a canvas sheet. And Richard told Darren that he killed the girl for, quote, business reasons, and immediately asked for Darren's help to get rid of the body. So according to Richard, he had bought, I don't know why, he had bought a police car, like a retired police car from an auction, and that is what he was driving around. And that can obviously get a lot of attention. And so he did not want to have to dispose of a body in that car, so he wanted to be able to use Darren's car instead. And I think Darren was even driving his girlfriend's car at the time. It wasn't even his own. And so Darren agreed to help transport this body to wherever Richard wanted to bury it, and off they went. Richard had decided that he wanted to bury the girl's body in the backyard of his mother's home in Staten Island. So they crossed state lines with these remains and went to his mother's house. And according to Darren, they started to dig underneath his mother's kitchen window. She was totally unaware of what was going on. I don't even think she knew that they were there. And when they were digging, Darren said they began to exhume a whole other set of remains. And so Darren's looking at Richard like, what? And Richard's like, oh yeah, it's just another business deal gone bad. And just kept on pushing. So that so far is 2 murders that Darren is aware of. But this brings us to the third, which is that of Anna. So according to Darren, it was pretty much the exact same scenario where Richard's like, hey, look what I have in my garage, and goes to show the body of another young girl, which we know as Anna. Darren said that they decided to take Anna's body behind the Burger King, and they were originally going to bury it on the lot directly behind the Burger King, the one that I said was a motel lot. But what they didn't know is that while it looked overgrown and all of that, the foundation for that motel was left in. So when they started digging, they hit concrete, so they panicked and just kind of tossed her as if she wasn't even a human in the woods behind that lot. Now we have 2 bodies that he buried in Staten Island behind his mother's house, and then one that he disposed of in New Jersey, but Darren said that he still wasn't done. Darren told police of another young woman that he knew of that Richard had killed in November of 1982. This time, he said that they went to bury the remains in a very remote area of Triton Falls, which is in New Jersey. So we are now up to 4 murders, but still there were more. While 3 of those 4 victims were unknown, Darren didn't know their identity. I don't think Richard knew their identity. This one was one that both of these men had known well. Darren began to talk about the murder of 34-year-old William Ward. So William Ward was a drug dealer. He was a prison escapee, and I guess he was like a big wig in the drug community. So Richard and Darren would frequently be his enforcer. And so when he wasn't paid or things like that, I'm sure all of you know what an enforcer is. But regardless, for some reason, on September 21st or 22nd, Darren could not say for sure, of 1982, William Ward came over to Richard's house, which was absolutely nothing out of the norm. And while he was there, for some reason, there was some sort of disagreement about like illegal business work or just something along those lines, and an argument broke out. And Darren said it was a pretty serious argument. It eventually spilled out onto the patio. Out of nowhere, Richard went and grabbed a weapon and shot William Ward multiple times. And again, they disposed of the body. And at this point, Darren said that he was growing very tired of what was going on. He realized that this wasn't just like a 1 or 2 time thing, that Richard's like, hey, I messed up, I need your help. It's like a pattern. Richard's enjoying this. He's continuing it. And it seemed he had absolutely no intentions of stopping. And Darren had stopped keeping all of this to himself as well. He started to tell his girlfriend about it. So she knew about it and didn't come to police. And this time they buried William Ward's body at Mount Calvary Cemetery in Neptune, New Jersey. So this was just outside of Asbury Park. So 5 total murders. Now, as this information is coming in, like Darren's just letting it all flow, officers are scrambling to try to verify this information. I mean, things went from nothing to something very, very quickly. And they were not prepared, as I said, for what this was about to turn into. And so they're trying to verify things. Meanwhile, Richard was moved to 24-hour guarded isolation in Trenton State Prison, and the investigation into these claims really began. So at this point, they started questioning people left and right, like, how was all of this going on and no one saw or heard anything? And again, it turns out that there were lots of people that knew about certain things and never came forward. That just seems to be a pattern throughout this entire case, namely in the murder of William Ward that happened at Richard's apartment. After the shots were fired and there was all of this commotion, these 2 separate women came out at different times. Now, one of the women came out, and what she saw was Richard holding up a man that was covered in blood. And Richard immediately looked at her and was like, don't worry, don't panic, don't call the police. Like, I'm already taking care of it. I'm taking this man to the hospital. So I'm sure she maybe assumed that it was like an accidental thing. It was a drive-by something or another. The way that Richard presented it made it seem like he hadn't done anything. He was trying to help this guy. So she just kind of like shut her door and kept to herself. But the other woman saw more of what happened. She actually came outside immediately after the shooting and saw Richard standing above William Ward with the gun still in his hand. And she even mentioned that there was something on the gun. And Darren went and told police during his interview that he had been using a silencer. Both of these women had seen something suspicious, and I guess the following day they spoke to each other about it and realized our neighbor just killed somebody on the back patio. Now, eventually this information went and trickled down to a handful of other people that lived within this apartment building, and all of them for some reason decided to, quote, not push it. More than likely, they were insanely scared of what would happen to them if they said anything, or if Richard knew that they thought anything about what they had seen, because we're talking about their neighbor. So they never came forward and reported it to police. We need to verify information between what Darren had said and then obviously what Teresa had said. And it wasn't until early April, when search teams started to go out to the locations, that Darren had claimed he and Richard had hid the bodies. So the first place that they went to search was Triton Falls. Now, Triton Falls, they went to an area just off of Essex Road on April 15th, and they went directly to the location that Darren pointed them to. And sure enough, they unearthed the remains of a young girl. It was clear that she had been shot twice in the head, so very similar to Anna and how she was found. It matched the MO. And then a few days after this, they unearthed the remains on April 17th of William Ward in Mount Calvary Cemetery in Neptune. Again, Darren was able to lead them directly to this location, but they weren't able to say for sure it was William Ward yet. Obviously, a medical examiner had to prove the identity. So at the time, they've got 2 bodies. It's matching up with what Darren's saying, and they have to tell the media what is going on. So immediately they had to say, look, we think we've got a serial killer on our hands. We've got 2 remains that have been found. This guy's MO seems to be teenage girls. And as you can imagine, the phone started to ring off of the hook. All families that had missing loved ones that were young girls that they were so scared could have potentially fallen victim to this monster of a man. The calls were coming in left and right, and they continued into the next week when more bodies were found. Police went on that week, I think it was like that Monday, right away. They got a warrant to search the residence of Richard's mom, Sally. She lived in a home in the Charleston section of Staten Island, 420 Sherritt Road, and they brought in all sorts of equipment because they were pretty sure they were going to unearth remains. And while Darren had only mentioned 2, they believed it was very possible that there could be more there. So they had an entire team there digging, backhoes, all sorts of stuff. And sure enough, they found 2 more sets of remains buried on top of each other, which is exactly what Darren had described. Now, when these other 2 women were found and it was reported to the news, more frantic calls started coming in to the point where they decided to establish like a special phone line just for these calls so that they could rule out one missing girl after another, speak to these families, try to let them know that police were exhausting every possible avenue that they could. They were trying to identify them as soon as possible so that these families wouldn't have to just sit in fear for weeks. And police were also asking anyone with missing family members or a friend that vanished between February of 1981 and January of 1983 to come forward because this is the time frame that they kind of believed things were going on. So the media was covering the story nonstop, as you can imagine, because this was not something every day. It's not very often that you legitimately come across a serial killer. And during all of this, the prosecutor that was involved in Anne's case, because those charges were already going, was announcing that he was fully planning on pushing for the death penalty. He was also saying that there were likely more charges imminent for all of these other remains that were found. And by April 22nd, the identity of the different remains that had been found were revealed. So on April 22nd specifically, one of the sets of remains was identified as 17-year-old Maria Caella, and this was one of the sets of remains that were behind Richard's mother's home. So unfortunately, one thing that has been, it's gonna make me cry. I don't know why I'm like this. One thing that sucked has been that when I've looked into like this entire case, you find so much about Richard, which is important because I think understanding the psychology behind serial killers is the only way to hopefully eventually prevent them or stop them before something happens. But there's nothing at all on these young girls, like on these victims of his, there's just no information. And I can't stand that because they're the ones who deserve to be remembered because they never should have been taken from this earth, from their loved ones at all. So I have very basic information on all of these people, but just try to listen and take it in and view them as the human beings that they were. So Maria was born on September 27th, 1964 to Armando and Mary, and she was living in Brick, New Jersey. She was described as being an incredibly talented girl with a love for art, a love for music. She had huge dreams of graduating from high school and then going to South Carolina to go to college. She wanted to be able to study music further. And on Halloween night of 1981, she left her home around 6 p.m. She was wearing a big white fur jacket, beige slacks, a denim vest, and tinted sunglasses because she was apparently going to a Halloween party on the beach, which was her all-time favorite place to be. She told her mom and dad where she was going. Her dad gave her $1 to buy a snack or a drink, and off she went. But Maria never came home. She was immediately reported missing by her family that knew that this was out of character for her. She was a good girl. She followed the rules. She was responsible. They immediately knew that something had to have happened. And so the grueling search for Maria began. It actually started with a sighting. So a police officer had seen Maria walking down Route 88 at about 12:20 a.m. and she was heading the direction of her home. So based on the time, she said she'd be back around midnight. She was trying to get there. So this police officer, who was on his way to a call at the time when he first saw Maria, decided that on his way back, he was going to stop and give her a safe ride home just because you never know. And he said that the call that he was at took less than 10 minutes. He was already back on Route 88 and Maria was nowhere to be seen. In that very short time frame, Maria had been taken. And based on everything that Teresa was saying and Darren was saying, basically Richard would lure these young girls into his car. He would seem like this great, nice, innocent guy. He would promise them things like a marijuana cigarette, or like, just seemed like he was trying to be helpful. And during this time, hitchhiking was common, getting rides with people was common. So it didn't seem like a threat. But unfortunately, that's exactly what his intentions were. Now, her family at the time obviously didn't know this, so they exhausted every possible option to try and locate her. They hired PIs, they went to psychics, and Detective Rudy Moritz, who was the lead investigator in the case, left absolutely no stone unturned. They searched the entire area, they brought in helicopters. They had never found a single clue until that April of 1983, when so many other families, including Maria's, had their world turned absolutely upside down. When they received the answer of what had happened to their loved one, and it was that this deranged man had taken them from the world. By April 23rd, it was announced that William Ward was in fact the remains. Again, they pretty much knew that was going to be who they had located, but they were able to formally identify him. And the other set of remains that had been found at Triton Falls, they were able to announce that same day that they belonged to a young girl named Elizabeth Jane Bacon, who went by the name of Betsy. So Betsy Bacon was from Seagirt, New Jersey, and she had gone missing on November 20th, 1982. She had told her mom around 11 p.m. that she was heading up to a nearby 7-Eleven in Spring Lake Heights. She needed to pick up a pack of cigarettes, I think, and she was off. But Betsy never returned home. Family desperately searched for her, tried to locate her, but they had no idea the reality behind her disappearance, again, until she was identified in 1983, and it was theorized by police that the exact same thing happened. She had been walking along Route 71 to get to the 7-Eleven gas station, and Richard was probably out on the prowl, lurking as he always did, and lured her in with all sorts of promises. Maybe he'd buy her that pack of cigarettes, maybe he would drive her to the gas station. Honestly, who knows? Then she was gone. And then they were able to identify that second set of remains that had been buried with Maria behind Sally's home. Those were of 18-year-old Deborah Osborne. So Deborah, who again I wasn't able to find much information on, was reported missing in Tom River, New Jersey. All I was really able to find was that she was attending Central Regional High School in Berkeley at the time. She was a member of St. Joseph's Roman Catholic Church. I believe she had 2 sisters, and she was reported missing on April 8th of 1982. She was last seen leaving a place called Idle Hour Bar and Lounge. I have seen that she was allegedly heading to work at this time as a chambermaid at a local hotel near Pleasant Point, but unfortunately she never showed up there and she never returned home. I don't know how extensive the search was for her. I wasn't able to find any details at all. But again, it was believed that Deborah had been lured into Richard's car during this walk. So on top of all of these murders, all of these remains that they had found and were able to identify, police started to look into other possible victims, because we're talking about multiple murders between like the very end of 81 and then all through 82. And they believe there were possibly many times that Richard had acted alone. Yes, a lot of the time he tried to involve Teresa, he involved Darren, but that doesn't mean that there weren't other instances. And on top of that, he was released in 75 after being sentenced to life in prison for murder. This led them to the murder of John Patrone, and this was back in 1978. So pretty much right after he started skipping out on his parole officer, and when things started to get kind of sketchy again. And I'm pretty sure it was Darren that told police about this, because I've seen in certain reports that he led them to the body, and John Patrone's body was ultimately found in 83. So this wasn't something that Darren was physically at, but I believe he had just been told about it by Richard. So John Petrone and Richard had known each other through prison. So very similar situation to Richard and Darren and Richard and William Ward. And they, I guess, remained in touch. And at some point, for some reason, they decided in 78 that they were going to go to an abandoned airport in Flemington, New Jersey to shoot tin cans. It was like close range target practice that they were doing. And for some reason, in the middle of all this, Richard decided that John was going to be the new target. After telling him to go and set the new cans back up, the moment John came back, Richard point blank put the gun to John's head and killed him. And after killing him, he buried him at Collier's Mills Wildlife Preserve just outside of Jackson, New Jersey. Now, police went out to this location in 1983. I believe that it was about 3 miles into the preserve off of the main road, and this was on like a dirt road, and then 50 feet off of that dirt road, they found the grave. John Petrone had been buried just a few feet down, and then on top of his body, Richard had put tires, like the frame of a car seat, things that would probably deter someone from moving them to see what was underneath. But despite finding these remains, for some reason, police didn't feel that they had enough to charge Richard for this murder. However, the one thing that was different about this murder is that it's kind of one of the only ones where there seemed to be a motive other than just killing for the thrill of it. So according to what I have seen reported, John Petrone was also an informant. So obviously that could have posed as a risk for Richard. He was close to this guy, and maybe Richard was worried that he would turn him in, give over information to police about Richard and the things that he had been doing. So it's theorized that he maybe killed John for that reason, to keep him quiet. Then that makes you wonder what on earth John Petrone may have known about Richard, especially since it happened in 78. Like, did John Petrone know something that had happened between 75 and 78? And now we're all just left guessing. On top of that, there was another theory, and again, I can't confirm this, but it's also been said that John Petrone potentially tried to extort $2,000 from Richard's mother. So maybe that has something to do with it. Honestly, we will never know, but it seems like the only time Richard killed was either A, for the thrill of it, which was these young girls, or B, to preserve himself, like to protect himself from possibly being caught. But when they found the remains of John, this did end up leading them to another possible victim. And this is Virginia Clayton. So in 1982, so it fits in the time frame, Virginia Clayton, who was a young girl, I believe she was 17. I can't say for sure because, again, I couldn't find a lot of information on her, but she left her home in the Freehold Township off of Route 537 with plans to go to Seaside Heights. And Virginia never made it home. Now, her family and police immediately jumped into action. They tried to locate her. They were passing out flyers. And somehow within 3 days, they managed to find her remains. She had been stabbed and dumped in Collier's Mills Wildlife Management Preserve. So I think it was only within like 3 or 4 miles of where John Petrone had been buried. And this was interesting because Richard had the tendency of kind of putting people in the same places. After all, he literally buried someone on top of somebody else. So the timing, her walking along Route 537, it all just seemed to fit into that possibility. But unfortunately, they were never able to prove this, so he never faced any charges, and her case remains unsolved to this day. So in the end, police only had enough information to charge Richard with 5 murders. The murders of Maria, Deborah, Anna, William, and Betsy. The trial for Anna began in November of 1983. As you can imagine, it was a lot. There were a lot of people that wanted to be able to see what was going on. This was heavily publicized. There was a lot of question on whether they could successfully give him a fair trial in Monmouth County because everyone knew what had happened there. But ultimately, they were able to continue forward with the trial. When it began, it became very clear, again, how absolutely senseless all these murders were. Monmouth prosecutor Alexander Lair said that Richard simply killed, quote, because he wanted to see somebody die. There was absolutely no rhyme or reason. There was never any sexual assault. There was never anything. He just seemed to enjoy being able to lure people in, trusting him, and then he would kill them just to watch it. And this was where, for the first time, he was coined the thrill killer. Now, Darren and Teresa did play a pretty huge role in the trial. While Darren was in fact facing charges, Teresa wasn't, yet she was still out victim hunting and didn't report a body that she had found. So this was kind of an opportunity for the defense and the prosecutor to be like, well, what on earth were you doing? Like, questioning them left and right. Now, Darren particularly said that he didn't agree at all with what Richard was doing, that he was just helping out a friend initially, and that eventually he said Richard became irrational. Now, my personal opinion is that he had been irrational the entire damn time. But regardless, Darren said he came to the conclusion after a while that Richard just couldn't be stopped. I think he did try to speak to Richard a handful of times, ask him why he was killing, and Richard said that it was because society owed him and it helped to release tension. Between hearing this from Richard and realizing that this was not anything that was ending anytime soon, and I guess Richard also ended up killing Darren's cat, Darren started to contemplate whether he should just kill Richard himself. He said that that was the point that he made it to, that he didn't think that there was going to be any other plausible way to stop all of the murders unless Richard himself was dead and could not commit them anymore. And so he was like, I'm going to take this guy out. But before he was able to do it, Anna's remains were found, and all of a sudden, both of them were arrested. Meanwhile, the defense was arguing that Darren was actually the one behind all of this, that he was the mastermind. He was the one that killed all these people, basically saying that him bringing forward all this information wasn't because he was just participating in it on the side. He knew so much because he was the one who did it. Keep in mind that DNA wasn't a thing yet, so that was a very compelling argument for a few people. But ultimately, Richard was found guilty and he was sentenced to death by lethal injection. While they finally had justice for Anna, and this man was never going to be able to harm anyone ever again, there was still just like this nagging feeling for everyone that none of this should have happened to begin with. He never should have been released from his life sentence, and all of these lives were lost because that decision was made. Now, a few months after the trial for Anna's murder in late February of 1984, he then went to trial for the murder of William Ward, and again, he was found guilty, but during sentencing, the jury ended up deadlocked. They couldn't decide between life in prison or another death sentence for Richard, and so ultimately the judge decided on life in prison. By September of 1984, Richard, at this point, I believe, realized that he wasn't getting out of any of this. He already had one life sentence, he already had one death sentence, and so he decided to plead guilty to the murders of both Maria and Deborah, and ended up getting 2 30-year terms added on to his sentence for both of those murders. Meanwhile, Darren ended up going to trial, and he only received 5 years in prison for all of his participation. And I don't know the outcome of Diane. I tried to look it up so many times. Again, it just seems like she's non-existent in this story, but it does seem still that the consensus was that she had no idea of what her husband was doing. So now during this time, there still had not been a trial for Betsy Bacon, and I have seen on a few different resources people state that he was never charged for Betsy Bacon's murder, but from documents that I looked at, like court documents, he was. It just took a couple of years, and I can't seem to figure out why. But during this time, while there is still no trial for Betsy Bacon, in January of '89, the absolute unthinkable happens. Like, you wouldn't think we'd be here again, but we're here again. Richard's death sentence was overturned. He was up for resentencing, you guys. And there's no telling what that could end up meaning. As we have seen in a lot of different cases that I have gone over and that you've probably seen in documentaries and other true crime YouTubers and podcasts, when you have these heavily publicized cases, which if there is the potential for death sentence, usually they're heavily publicized, it's always followed by protests from people that believe that the death sentence is cruel and unusual punishment. There's a big line in the sand of people that think the death penalty is okay and people that think it's not. And this is kind of what ended up happening. There were a lot of people that were very vocal. And so an appeal was made by Richard that this was cruel and unusual punishment. And somehow this ended up going through. But it didn't work out in his favor because at his resentencing, the jury was like, no, you're not getting out of this. And they resentenced him the death penalty. But this resentencing of the death penalty created not just such an outcry from certain members of the community, but also from Richard, that somehow his case reached all the way up to the Supreme Court. In August of 1991, again, his death sentence was overturned, and it remained that way. They instead gave him another life sentence, which would technically be the third life sentence that he had received in his lifetime. And he was like 50-something years old. But at the very least, he was in prison. He was serving 3 life sentences plus 60 years. There was no way he was ever going to get out to do this harm to anyone else. And finally, in 1993, he did end up pleading guilty to the murder of Betsy Bacon. So there was finally a conviction and sentencing for that. While Richard did try to appeal his case multiple times, as I'm sure everyone expected him to, none of it ever seemed to work out, thankfully, this time. I think at this point, hopefully, everyone realized the danger that he presented to society, and so there wasn't ever any changing him. There had never been any changing him since he was 5 years old, so he remained in prison until March of 2008 when he died of respiratory and kidney failure. And while he did remain in prison all of that time, and there was some bit of justice for these families, I just still can't help but fall apart on the inside, knowing that all of these lives could have been spared had he not been released from his first life sentence. So many people lost their loved ones. So many families were shattered from his actions. And so a lot of people were trying to understand how that happened. Now, the New York Times did do quite a few articles on this, and they even went to try to question the different chairmen of the parole board at the time to figure out how this happened. And interestingly, the chairman of the board of parole in 1974, when asked about it, claimed to not even remember Richard or his case, which is so unsettling because how do you just forget that? I know it's easy to become very desensitized to these sorts of things, but when you're dealing with the safety of the public, when you're dealing with a dangerous individual like that, you can't just breeze through this and forget these people and hope that they don't continue committing these crimes. So hearing that honestly really sucks. And then they were able to speak to the current chairman of the parole board at the time of the article, and he apparently said, after reading up on the files, that Richard was, quote, an average inmate, and under the standards and law existing then, I see nothing unreasonable in his being released. Which, in my personal opinion, I think is a bunch of word vomit to cover their own ass from lawsuits, because there is nothing that should have allowed him to be released like that after 17 years. When you compile all of his history, all of his psych evaluations for his entire life up to that point, it should have been very clear he was not changing. As I stated, the prosecutor on the case strongly believes that there are over 100 victims of Richard Biegenwald, and we just don't know about them because there was no way to connect them at the time. But the chances that he just didn't do anything between 75 and 81 just doesn't seem likely at all. So there's been a lot of hope in recent years with all of the different changes in DNA, genealogy, like all of these advances in technology, that maybe we'll be able to figure out more victims and give some sort of closure to these families and some sort of answer. Unfortunately, when these crimes occurred, it was a while ago. So based on the age of his victims, it's very likely that their parents, who may still be sitting and waiting for answers, are either incredibly old or they are already deceased. So that breaks my heart, because that means there could be so many families out there that died without ever knowing. But that's why I really wanted to share this case, because I just feel like not enough people know about it. There's not enough coverage of it. And one of the best resources on this is actually a book that came out called The Jersey Shore Thrill Killer by John O'Rourke. And he has covered this case top to bottom. He's looked into everything, and he has an incredible YouTube channel where he has spoken to different CSI agents on the case, an investigator on the case. He goes through so much, and you actually get to hear what these different investigators and people looking into this case were kind of going through at the time. And the amount of disbelief in the community and the scary things that they found, and, you know, having to tell these families what had happened to their loved ones and what the families had to say about it. And there's just a lot of great information in that. It's just too possible that there are so many more victims out there that have gone unknown to stop talking about it. So just as a brief rundown for those of you who may live in that sort of area, maybe you were that age at the time in the area. Richard typically did not sexually assault his victims. I don't think there's any instance of that. He did have those potential charges in New York back in 1980, but those didn't go through. That's not to say that he didn't do that. He would sometimes use a knife as a weapon. He would sometimes use a gun. Without going into too much detail, he also was known to use trash bags in terms of his victims, and sometimes they had been dismembered. Also was apparently known for moving his victims. When they were searching his mother's house, they came across an empty grave, and I think they did end up determining that he had just moved one of his victims, but to me, it makes me wonder if he's willing to do that once. Has he done it multiple times? If you're someone that frequently goes through NamUs and you're looking through cases trying to match things up, if you ever see anything like that, that's definitely something to look into. I'm sure there's already so many people looking into it, but having more eyes is never going to harm anything. Investigators have said that he didn't necessarily have a particular type of victim, but the one thing that did seem somewhat consistent was that the girls all had like shoulder length to collarbone length brown hairs. I also want to take this as a time to encourage you guys to donate to the Cold Case Foundation. Again, I will try to put a way to donate down below. We can start a fundraiser because I feel like cold cases can be so forgotten. They're put on a back shelf. There are cold case units out there, but sometimes they just have too many. There's just nothing to continue working with. Through donating to the Cold Case Foundation, making sure that there are eyes on these different cases, again, that could help bring closure to victims that may have had their life taken at the hands of people like Richard Biegenwald. Just because someone went missing or was murdered decades ago, that does not make them any less important when it comes to figuring out what happened to them, getting them justice, and hopefully eventually getting information to their families that have waited so incredibly long for answers. But on that note, you guys, I'm going to go ahead and go. I know that this one was a particularly heavy one, and unfortunately the next few that I'm going to be looking into but they are ones that need to be out there and need to be known about. So hang in there with me. Take a break if you need to. Don't push yourself to watch true crime if it's going to cause you any sort of distress. I know that there's a lot of people that will just continue to consume this kind of content without really thinking about their own mental health. So just here to tell you, check in on yourself. Be careful with this type of content, and I'm gonna go ahead and go. Thank you guys so much for taking the time out of your day to remember all of these victims. Literally screw the man that should not be named. Thank you for taking your time to listen about these victims and remember that they were people. If you haven't already, go ahead and hit the subscribe button down below to become a part of the Hallen fam so that we can hopefully bring them home together or bring them justice together, and I will see you guys in my next video.